What if I told you that the moment Jesus was nailed to the cross, the heavens didn't just stand still? What if I told you that right above the blood-stained earth, at that very instant, two of the most powerful archangels in existence, Michael, the warrior of heaven, and Uriel, the fiery flame of God, were not only watching, but intervening? You've heard the story of the crucifixion countless times, but I assure you, you've never heard it like this before. Hidden in the shadows of Calvary and realms, most don't dare to discuss something took place that defies logic and challenges everything you thought you knew about that moment. So ask yourself, why did the sky go dark at noon? What was happening in the spirit while Jesus' body hung in agony? And what exactly did Michael and Uriel do when the King of Glory was pierced by that Roman spear? Stay with me, because what these two archangels did at the cross will completely transform your understanding of spiritual warfare and the depths of Jesus' sacrifice. It's time to uncover what's been hidden for so long. Ready to dive deeper? Common 7 FE 7. If you're prepared for the truth that's about to unfold, let's go beyond the surface and reveal the mysteries of Calvary. Shocked hell. Michael and Uriel expose Lucifer at the cross. If you think the story of Calvary was confined to a dusty hill outside Jerusalem, surrounded by Roman soldiers and curious onlookers, you've only glimpsed a fragment of the truth. Most people see the cross merely through earthly eyes. They picture the rough wood, the torn flesh of a man gasping for breath, and the sneering mouths of those who mocked him. That's all very real, but it's only the outer crust of a mystery far older, far darker, and infinitely more magnificent. Imagine for a moment if you could slip beyond the boundary of flesh and sight. If you could peer through the thin veil that separates the world of men from the realm of spirits, what would you behold hovering over that grim hill called Golgotha? What if I told you that just above the cries of the crowd and the clang of Roman hammers, an ancient war was reaching its most critical hour? A conflict that began long before Adam ever drew his first breath. Let me guide you into that unseen dimension where reality takes on a sharper, more terrifying clarity. Scripture gives us a clue. It records that around midday, a strange terror seized the earth. The Gospel of Matthew says, from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. Matthew 27:45. But was this merely a quirk of nature, a passing eclipse? The sky didn't grow dim or murky. It turned black, swallowing light itself for 3 relentless hours. Birds fell silent. The ground seemed to hold its breath, and men's hearts quivered under an oppression they couldn't name. But this darkness was no ordinary shadow. It was as if heaven had pulled a curtain across the sun, not to hide the spectacle, but to mark a battleground. In the spiritual realm, that dimension layered invisibly atop our own. A tempest raged. Can you imagine standing there feeling the weight of an atmosphere so thick with conflict that even angels hushed their songs? Not a single seraph lifted a voice in worship. Instead, the heavenly host hovered in tense, watchful silence, as though the very outcome of eternity teetered on the agony unfolding below. Have you ever felt a darkness in your own life that seemed to go beyond bad luck or human cruelty? A gloom that was almost tangible, as if something far larger was at play. Perhaps what enveloped Golgotha that day was a cosmic echo of the battles still waged over human souls. It's a sobering thought. While men drove nails and cast lots for garments, unseen forces clashed in a fury that could scarcely be contained by the skies. So, what really happened above Calvary in that theater where Michael and Uriel stood watch where Lucifer himself dared to approach the trembling earth? Could it be that in that dreadful hush lines were being drawn and kingdoms were being weighed? Hold on to that thought, for the story is only beginning to unfold. Lucifer, the fallen one, the ancient serpent who once led choirs of blazing stars in the courts of heaven, reclined upon his throne of shadows, eyes fixed on Calvary with a chilling satisfaction. Can you picture it? The same being who once glided through streets of transparent gold, whose voice had crafted harmonies that filled eternity, now lurking in darkness, savoring what he believed was his greatest triumph. Ever since Eden, when he first heard that haunting decree ripple through the garden, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Genesis 3:15. He had plotted for this day. For millennia, he twisted kingdoms, whispered into thrones, and incited men to bloodshed, all to reach this ghastly spectacle. The promised seed of the woman strung up, mutilated, abandoned, or so it appeared. But pause and imagine, did Lucifer truly understand what was happening as he coiled there in his infernal pride, convinced that heaven's story was unraveling? He failed to see who else had gathered at the edge of mortal sight. For Lucifer was not alone in his watching, hovering in realms untouched by human senses, were Tuku, of the most enigmatic and arrogant beings ever to stand near the throne of God. Michael, the archangel of war, commander of heavenly armies, whose name means "who is like God," was stationed there, and beside him stood Uriel, the archangel of divine light and hidden secrets, whose very essence burned with the wisdom of the Almighty. Can you feel the tension that must have throbbed between them? A vibration deeper than sound itself. Michael's presence was overwhelming, almost too vast for even the spiritual plane to contain. He towered like a living mountain, clothed not in ornamental gold, but in an armor that rippled with ancient fire flames older than the sun itself. Every plate bore inscriptions of God's covenant names: El Shaddai, Jehovah, Nissi, Elohim, glowing as if seared into the metal by the hand of God. In his mighty grasp, a sword blazed its blade, humming with power, carved with the very breath of the Creator. And what of his wings? They were not mere feathers, but swirling expanses that shimmered like nebula, entire galaxies seemingly locked in perpetual flame. Uriel was a vision so intense it could scorch the soul. His entire being resembled a furnace set to the brilliance of 10,000 suns, his eyes molten with revelations that no mortal mind could hold without splintering. Though Scripture scarcely names him, ancient writings whisper of Uriel as the keeper of prophecy and the interpreter of divine riddles, a confidant to mysteries too weighty for earthly tongues. These two had been silent watchers for ages, present at every critical turning in God's intricate tapestry of redemption. They were the keepers of divine thresholds, ensuring that every jot and tittle of God's timeline advanced uncorrupted. Now here they stood, or more precisely flanked the trembling boundary between heaven and earth, bearing witness to the unthinkable. Their own Creator nailed to splintered wood, gasping in human frailty. Imagine being there, swept into that supernatural vantage point, feeling the cold of Lucifer's smug dominion, yet seeing Michael's fierce readiness and Uriel's incandescent intensity. Would your heart not quake to wonder what clash might ignite if Lucifer dared step beyond what heaven permitted? Or would you sense that these angelic titans were not poised for immediate battle, but were guardians of a deeper, far more astonishing plan, one that might even reach into your own struggles and secret shames? And so they waited, as did all of creation, holding its breath at the precipice of a moment that would alter eternity. But what would happen next? In that charged silence between life and death, pride and promise remained veiled, drawing you closer to see the mystery unfold. The ground itself convulsed, quaking under a weight it was never meant to bear. But if you could have pierced the veil, separating the physical from the spiritual, you would have witnessed a far more harrowing scene. The spirit realm wasn't just disturbed, it was screaming. As Jesus' battered body strained against the nails, releasing guttural cries that echoed across Judea, something profound shifted in that invisible dominion that overlays our reality like a second skin. Angels assigned to the lower heavens began to quake. Their brilliant forms, accustomed to songs and divine errands, shivered with an unease that rippled through creation. Even darker beings, the demonic hordes that had gathered in twisted delight to watch Lucifer's triumph, started to recoil. Could you picture that legions of malevolent spirits, once gleeful over the mutilation of heaven's prince, now backing away from Golgotha's skull-shaped hill eyes, darting talons, twitching as if sensing that the ground beneath them might split open and swallow them whole because something wasn't adding up? This was supposed to be Lucifer's hour of crowning victory, the crescendo of a plot sown in Eden's whispering leaves. But it was all too quiet. No struggle, no angelic armies descending in fury to snatch their king from mortal hands. It was as though Jesus was allowing it. And that realization sent tremors of dread through the ranks of hell. Isn't it haunting to consider that demons grasped a secret many believers still stumble over today? That power, voluntarily restrained, is infinitely more terrifying than power violently unleashed. Think of the weight of that. Jesus, battered and nailed, still held all the authority of the cosmos. He could have spoken a single word, and 12 legions of angels, that's over 70,000 divine warriors, each more dreadful than human imagination could tolerate, would have torn the earth to ribbons to rescue him. Remember how in 2 Kings 19, a solitary angel struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. Multiply that devastation exponentially, and you glimpse what hung silently on the edge of his breath. Or what if Jesus had merely lifted his eyes and beckoned fire from heaven, as Elijah once did against the soldiers of Ahaziah? In an instant, Golgotha could have become nothing but molten ruin. Lucifer's forces incinerated by holy wrath. And yet none of this happened. There was no thunder, no blaze, no righteous slaughter, only a haunting stillness pierced by the soft, labored breathing of the crucified king. And in the unseen realms, that silence was more deafening than the roar of 1,000 storms. High above the hill, Michael's colossal frame was wound tight, every muscle coiled like a predator restrained by chains. His mighty hand gripped the hilt of his sword so fiercely that waves of celestial energy rippled out, bending the spiritual atmosphere. His eyes darted to Uriel, whose entire being blazed with prophetic fire. But Uriel did not flinch. He stood, incandescent and unyielding eyes, locked unwaveringly on Jesus' anguished face, even from the height of heaven. Could it be that these exalted guardians, so often dispatched to defend heaven's throne or execute swift judgment, knew a depth to this moment that escapes us still? And what about you? If you were standing amid those dark forces, watching angels hold their breath and demons scatter in confusion, wouldn't your own spirit begin to tremble? Might it not dawn on you that the most fearful display of might is found not in explosions of violence, but in sacrificial surrender? That true power rests not in defending oneself, but in laying everything down to fulfill a purpose deeper than death. So, Michael and Uriel watched, silent witnesses to a cosmic gamble, gripping secrets they dared not reveal. They knew something hell had overlooked. They understood what was about to burst forth from that haunting quiet. Something that would ripple across eternity, reaching even into the battles you face today. But that revelation was yet to come, hovering on the cusp of time as all of heaven and hell awaited breathless. Now, lean in. Let your heart grow still. Because what I'm about to unfold reaches far beyond dusty hills and iron nails. Before there was even such a thing as time. Before light itself ever shattered the primordial void to reveal the first star, a scroll lay secure in the throne room of eternity. Not just any scroll. This was the scroll, sealed 7 times over by the very hand of God. Within its sacred folds were inscribed every detail of the universe's redemption. Each prophecy, etched like living flame, every precise heartbeat and tear that would lead mankind from ruin to glory. Can you fathom such a document? To think that long before Eve first drew breath, your story, your rescue was already scripted into this divine parchment. And now, at this hour on Golgotha, the seals were opening one by one under the somber gaze of all creation. This was not the chaos of defeat. It was the deliberate unveiling of a plan so profound that even eternity seemed to hush in awe. Jesus wasn't hanging there because he was overpowered. How could he be the one by whom all things were made? Jonah 1:3 chose this descent. He was dying not as a victim, but as a victor, waging a war that no sword or legion could fight. Imagine a conflict where triumph demanded plunging deeper than death, darker than mankind's filthiest sins, lower than hell's deepest caverns, and then rising from within them, wearing their defeat like a crown. Uriel, the radiant keeper of divine mysteries, understood this strategy. His very being pulsed with the foreknowledge of what was unfolding, even if it scorched him to watch. Michael, that mighty fortress of celestial war, felt it resonating in his immortal bones. This was the appointed hour. Yet despite knowing, they both stood suspended in a tension that no angel had ever tasted helplessness. They who had torn kingdoms apart at a single command could not lift a finger unless heaven itself thundered the order. Their sword stayed at their sides. Their wings remained still until the sun decreed otherwise. They could only watch. Then it happened. Jesus' voice, ragged from thirst and agony, burst forth in a cry that split worlds. Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? But don't mistake this for a mere lament echoing off Jerusalem's stones. This was no frail gasp of a man defeated. It was a roar disguised as anguish, a declaration so potent it carved through dimensions like lightning through night. Imagine standing there watching the archangels stiffen, as if an electric current surged straight from that blood-soaked cross into the highest heavens. In the split second after Jesus' cry shattered the silence, Michael turned to Uriel. There was no fear in his blazing eyes, only reverence. Reverence so profound it seemed to bow even the constellations. Could it be that even these mighty ones had never before witnessed love wielded as the sharpest weapon? In that stillness, in the breath that hovered between heaven and earth, the king, bloodied, gasping, enthroned on timber, issued a command no mortal ear could catch. It was not roared by cherubim, nor proclaimed by trumpet blast. No storm ripped across the heavens. Yet every throne, every dominion, every hidden demon lurking beneath the shadow of the cross felt it as a tremor of holy dread, a whisper that bypassed air and flesh, striking straight into the spirit realm. From Jesus's dying soul to Michael and Uriel stationed above it flowed like a river of light. And what was the message that rippled through all that is seen and unseen. It was devastatingly simple. Hold the line. Guard what is mine. Have you ever wondered if right now, in the chaos of your own life, such a divine whisper might be echoing still? That perhaps while you're reeling under burdens you barely understand, heaven's armies stand in silent formation, holding their line at the King's decree, preserving destinies written in that ancient scroll, including yours. And so it was on that dreadful hill, with demons scattering and angels tightening their ranks. All of creation braced for what would come next. A command had been given, the battlefield set, but the final strike lay just beyond the horizon of this moment. And you, drawn into this mystery, are left to wonder what impossible victory was about to break through the darkness. Now on the surface, those words hold the line guard. What is mine might not sound like they would ripple through eternity. But when they issued from the cracked lips of the eternal Son, the one through whom all things were made and in whom all things hold together. Colossians 1:16-19. Bleeding and crowned with twisted thorns, they ignited the very architecture of heaven. Can you imagine that a whisper from a dying man that made galaxies tremble and principalities stand to attention? At that exact moment, Jesus was balanced on the knife's edge of two realities. His battered body hung suspended in the realm of dust and breath, where Roman soldiers cast lots for his robe and crowds spat curses into the heavy air. But his soul, oh his soul, was already descending into the cavernous depths of death itself, reaching into the shadowed places reserved for the wages of sin. Yet despite every lash, every nail, every ragged gasp, his divine authority remained unbroken sovereign, utterly intact. And that's when Michael Heaven's relentless champion snapped into precise formation. From the very dawn of creation, Michael had been God's appointed general. Was it not he who contended with the spiritual powers over Persia and Greece? Daniel 13:20-21. Who guarded Israel's destiny when earthly thrones forgot their maker? Was it not Michael who, in the fierce panorama of Revelation, drove back the dragon and his rebellious angels, casting them out of the highest heaven? Revelation 12:7-9. At the cross, Michael was no passive observer. He was on sacred assignment. Hover with him now, just above the Roman sky. His immense form clad in armor, forged before time, loomed like a living fortress. His sword was already unsheathed, not to spill human blood this day, but to safeguard something infinitely more delicate. This time, he was not defending a nation with boundaries drawn on crumbling maps. He was protecting a single, solitary person, Jesus. But more was unfolding than even that. Michael stood as sentinel over a transaction of cosmic proportions as Jesus took on the sins of all humanity. Your failures, your hidden shames, your generational curses. It wasn't simply a crushing weight upon his shoulders. It was a legal handover, an unthinkable covenant exchange. The perfect lamb absorbing every stain so that no accusation from hell could stand against those who would trust him. The magnitude was so staggering, so pivotal, that hell itself convened to watch clustering and foul throngs around Golgotha. Can you picture it? Demons pressing close, eager for loopholes, hoping to twist a clause in heaven's law. That is precisely why Michael was there. No shadowed imp, no slithering spirit of confusion, no cunning prince of accusation would breach that blood-writ contract. Michael could not interfere in the physical. He could not strike down Roman executioners or pry nails from holy flesh. But in the spiritual dimension, he was unstoppable. Like an impregnable wall, he positioned himself between heaven's promise and hell's schemes, between the suffering Christ and the legalistic claws of demonic prosecutors who craved a chance to derail the covenant being etched in divine blood. Yet what of Uriel, unlike Michael Uriel, was not crafted for war's roar. His was not the thunder of clashing swords or the earthquake of heavenly armies. Uriel was flame, the very radiance of revelation. Where Michael carved away darkness with brute force, Uriel exposed it with blinding clarity. He was heaven's steward of secrets, the bearer of insights too searing for ordinary minds. At that grisly hill, Uriel's charge was no less fearsome. For in that dreadful hour, Jesus wasn't merely dying. He was becoming sin itself, the light of the world plunging deliberately into utter darkness. 2 Corinthians 5:21. Have you ever let that settle into your bones? That absolute purity didn't just brush up against corruption. It absorbed it entirely, so that redemption could emerge from within decay's depths. Uriel ablaze with the mysteries of God took his position to ensure that what Jesus accomplished would not be confined to a single moment or a lone hill outside Jerusalem. From that point, a surge of divine illumination burst forth, an invisible shock wave cascading through centuries, nations, and even the unborn souls of generations to come. This was the ripple that would one day blind Saul on the road to Damascus, transforming him into Paul, apostle of grace. It would stir humble fishermen to pen gospels that traveled farther than Rome's legions ever could. It would break open hearts in lands and languages that didn't yet exist on any map. As the first droplets of Jesus' blood soaked into the cracked Judean dust, Uriel moved. His brilliance intensified, releasing strands of revelation that began weaving through time's tapestry, seeding visions, unlocking scriptures, calling future worshipers out of idolatry and shadows. Could it be that even now, in the quiet recesses of your own life, those waves of light are still moving, still awakening, still echoing from that singular sacrifice? And so between Michael's immovable defense and Uriel's searing enlightenment, the dying Christ was guarded in realms unseen. A cosmic transaction was being sealed with angels as its fierce custodians, and the destiny of your very soul caught up in its unbreakable terms. Yet even this was only the threshold. The deeper marvel was still poised to break through the veil in a moment that would leave eternity itself breathless. Now lean even closer, because this is the moment where the supernatural surged into the natural so forcefully that history itself cracked open. Yet it remained anchored in every promise ever whispered by God. At the exact instant Jesus let out his final shuddering breath, something extraordinary happened in Jerusalem. The great veil in the temple, that towering thick barrier that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, tore in two from top to bottom. But hear this, that was not simply old cloth splitting under stress. That veil was the most sacred divider on earth, the visible mark of a terrifying truth that sinful humanity could not safely enter the blazing presence of a holy God. It was a heavy tapestry, reportedly the width of a man's hand, standing as a centuries-old line no one crossed. Only the high priest dared venture past it, and only once a year, with trembling hands and sacrificial blood, lest he be struck down. So, when that veil ripped apart at the moment Jesus died, it wasn't merely a fabric failure. It was the collapse of an entire spiritual boundary. Could you imagine standing in that temple court, hearing that deep tearing sound reverberate like thunder through the marble halls, and suddenly seeing the inner sanctuary expose the place where heaven once kissed earth, now shockingly laid bare? But here's what must overlook. That veil was more than woven threads. For generations, it was reinforced by unseen sentinels, angelic guardians, who upheld the separation, defending the sanctity of God's inner courts. Just as cherubim with flaming swords barred Adam and Eve from Eden. After the fall, heavenly beings protected this holy divide. And now, at Calvary's climactic hour, those ancient watchers, Michael and Uriel included, finally stood down. Not because they had failed, not because they were overpowered, but in perfect obedience to the unfolding decree, because at that breath, the Lamb had become the bridge. Jesus' broken body now spanned the chasm between humanity's corruption and God's blazing glory. There was no more need for veils, no more need for angelic barricades, no more need for rituals that could only temporarily shield men from divine wrath. What a wonder! The very angels who once defended separation now stepped back, yielding to a new and better way. Uriel, who had burned throughout this ordeal with mysteries older than mountains, released a final surge of holy light. It was as if revelation itself exhaled across ages, ensuring that what Jesus had accomplished would echo from that hill into every dark corner of future centuries. Somewhere beyond mortal sight, a sword was quietly sheathed. Michael, Heaven's general, did not leave the field as a defeated warrior. He lowered his blade in solemn awe, knowing the fiercest battle for access had just been won. Pause, and let this press into your spirit. What does it mean that Jesus issued a spiritual command from the agony of the cross? That while men sneered and wagged their heads, Michael and Uriel moved under orders no crowd could hear, enforcing and protecting decrees that reshaped eternity. Doesn't that whisper to you that even when your own circumstances look like utter defeat, when your strength bleeds out, when your reputation is mocked, when enemies circle with smirks on their faces, heaven might be swirling with angelic activity on your behalf, executing commands spoken over your life that no human ear can detect? Isn't it possible how that the most powerful movements of God in your story are born not out of your triumphs, but through the agonies you thought would destroy you? That sometimes the loudest declarations of heaven arrive as soft whispers carried on tears? Remember, this heaven doesn't operate by human optics. It isn't swayed by who's cheering or who's accusing. It moves according to what God has spoken. And often, his mightiest decrees are issued through pain, echoing quietly across realms until they manifest in unstoppable glory. So, as Jesus' blood darkened the earth and angelic swords returned to their scabbards, something had fundamentally changed. The veil was gone. The access was granted. And a story far from over was preparing to unfold in ways that would set hearts ablaze for millennia to come. The descent into Sheol. This was no mere poetic image, no symbolic flourish meant to stir religious hearts. This was a moment so staggeringly real, so spiritually seismic, that all creation seemed to hold its breath. Jesus had breathed his last at top Golgotha's hill. The ground itself convulsed under the weight of it. Rocks split open like fragile clay pots, and the towering veil in the temple tore itself in two as if an invisible hand had seized it. Men stood frozen in horror and confusion, staring up at a silent, lifeless body swaying on rough wood under an unnaturally dark sky. But they had no idea what was happening just beyond the thin crust of earth beneath their feet. For while the crowd shuffled away in uneasy silence, Jesus, the flawless, sinless, spotless Lamb of God, was already descending, not as a ghostly thought or some elegant metaphor, but spiritually, literally, eternally plunging into Sheol. This was not the meek Jesus of Sunday portraits. This was the Word of God in spirit form, still bearing the horrific scars of crucifixion, still robed in the appalling weight of humanity's sin, yours, mine, all of it, And astonishingly, he did not descend alone. Michael moved after him, silent, as a stalking tempest, wings dimmed, but still bristling with restrained fury. Uriel followed too, a living furnace of revelation, whose radiance lit up corridors that had never seen a single shard of holy light. But make no mistake, they weren't there to protect him. What could protect the Creator from his own creation? No, they descended simply to witness what no angel knew, in all the epochs of eternity, had ever seen the King of all glory entering hell's domain uninvited and entirely unchallenged. But what exactly was this place? Many imagine hell as twisted caricatures, flames, horns, pitchforks. Yet in the ancient Hebrew mind, Sheol was something altogether different. It was the shadowed realm of the dead, a vast holding place divided by divine decree. One side was a region of torment where the wicked awaited judgment, the other a place of peace, often called Abraham's bosom, where the righteous rested in hopeful anticipation. Between them yawned a great chasm. No human could ever cross a divide. Jesus himself described in Luke 16. But consider this. Jesus was not entering as a mere man anymore. He was the eternal Word in spirit, carrying still the gruesome evidence of his crucifixion wounds that bled not his guilt, but ours. He stepped into Sheol not as a trembling soul awaiting a verdict, but as the rightful king executing a long-promised claim. In the instant his foot crossed the threshold of that nether realm, all of Sheol convulsed. Can you imagine that surge, how every foul ancient being imprisoned there quivered in dread, the fallen watchers from before the flood, those titanic spirits bound in pits of gloom? For their rebellion sensed it. Their chains rattled with an alien terror. The monstrous giants of Genesis, reduced now to tormented shadows, shrank back from the unexpected blaze of holy presence. Even Lucifer felt it. He had departed Calvary, smug assured the tale was over. Yet now his dark dominion rippled with fear, for an intruder had come, one who needed neither army nor breath to wage his war. Jesus walked through hell's desolate halls, clothed not in angelic splendor, but in the authority of heaven itself. Behind him trailed Michael, his face like storm-wrought iron glowing with pent-up violence. He was forbidden to unleash, and Uriel blazing with such incandescent purity that darkness itself seemed to recoil and hiss. Pause here. Can you fathom what it means that Psalm 24 wasn't just beautiful poetry, but a prophetic script of this very invasion? Lift up your heads, O you gates. Be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Now read those lines again, but see them overlaid on this exact scene. The King of glory striding into the gloom of the dead, approaching gates older than Rome, older than Babylon. Gates hammered into being by rebellion itself. Did he knock? No. Did he raise his voice in thunder? He simply spoke calm and absolute, a voice wrapped in eternity open. And the gates began to groan, not from hinges turning, but because ancient legal bonds were snapping under a higher decree. Chains forged in curses, accusations, and death's long dominion broke apart without a single hammer strike. Could it be that even now, in places of your life that feel like locked tombs, Jesus still walks in with that same quiet sovereign authority, speaking words that cause unseen chains to shatter? Might there be dungeons inside you where guilt or fear has long held dominion that are already trembling under the weight of his whispered command? And so, with every step deeper into Sheol, with Michael's silent fury and Uriel's searing brilliance flanking him, the king advanced not to plead, not to bargain, but to take. And even then, the full extent of what he came to claim remained a holy mystery, waiting to burst forth in unstoppable power. Now this is where the scene sharpens into something almost unbearable in its power. Michael, that towering archangel, renowned throughout the ages as heaven's fiercest champion, stood not with sword raised to strike, but with sword drawn to validate. In this grim underworld where dread was the native air, Michael did not come to wage a chaotic battle. His presence was far more profound. He came to enforce. Because right there, in the sunless corridor of Sheol, Jesus was not petitioning. He was not pleading for access or negotiating some fragile ceasefire. He was taking possession. Picture it, the sinless king still bearing the ghastly wounds of the cross, walking through the dominion of death itself. His steps echoed with authority older than creation. He laid claim to the keys of death, of the grave, of every dank prison cell that ever held a human soul in torment. This was not a symbolic ritual. This was a legal reclamation of ownership. And Michael, standing slightly behind and to the side of Jesus, lifted his mighty sword in solemn declaration to every trembling watcher in the spirit realm. This transfer is lawful. With that silent proclamation, all of heaven's decrees aligned behind the act, rendering it irreversible. Can you fathom what it means that God doesn't simply barge in with brute force, but satisfies every demand of his own perfect justice, that Michael's raised blade was not to cut, but to certify, to announce before fallen angels, imprisoned giants, and the ghosts of rebellion, that this was done by the book of divine law, by covenant sealed in blood on Golgotha. And while Michael held his post enforcing Christ's sovereign authority, Uriel did something that should make every heart tremble with awe. From the first whispers of eternity, he had carried within him a fragment of God's sealed mysteries, revelations locked tight since before the world's foundations. Mysteries the prophets of old yearned to peer into, straining their spirits toward shadows of things to come. Mysteries even angels longed to unravel, yet were forbidden. Now, in the very belly of Sheol, Uriel began to unveil them. Can you imagine that eerie brilliance suddenly flaring to life in those hopeless depths? He unrolled what can only be described as a scroll of living light. As he did, truths hidden from ages past spilled out like rivers of fire. The underworld, accustomed to gloom and regret, was flooded with the revelation of the cross, the shocking fullness of what Jesus had accomplished. Souls who had languished there, clinging to promises spoken across generations, finally saw it with unveiled eyes. Abraham, who once stood on a starry night, hearing God swear by his own name, beheld the star his faith had truly pointed toward. Moses, who had glimpsed only a passing shadow of God's glory on Sinai, now stared full into the radiant face of redemption. David, whose psalms had danced on the edge of prophetic rapture, sang again with tears streaming as he watched the final Lamb appear. Elijah, swept up once by a chariot of flame, witnessed a fire far holier, the flame of divine love consuming sin itself. What do you think that did to the heart of Sheol? This wasn't merely a descent. It was a cosmic jailbreak. Gates forged by rebellion groaned under forces they had never been built to withstand. Shackles that had bound generations shattered not by force of steel, but by the unveiled truth of a plan conceived before time. Pause here and let it pierce you. Might there be mysteries God has yet to unfold in your own life? Revelations that could turn your personal prisons into gates of release? Could it be that even now, spiritual scrolls are opening over your story? Scrolls declaring debts, paid captives, freed destinies realigned. So there in Sheol Michael stood immovable, his sword a living verdict, that all was being done in line with heaven's highest law. Uriel blazing, with sacred insight, unleashed revelations that set ancient hearts ablaze and loosed them from death's grip. And at the center of it all, Jesus, our King, our ransom, our victorious Lamb, marched forward, not with a request, but with an unstoppable claim. The underworld would never be the same again, and neither would any soul who truly grasped what had just taken place. Finally, there in the deepest cavern of death, farther than any mortal dread has ever reached, Jesus stood unmoved. Shadows that had ruled over millennia cowered before him, and then with deliberate authority he stretched out his hand. In that instant, within the unseen corridors of the spirit realm, something astounding materialized. Keys appeared, but not like anything men could craft or demons could corrupt. They weren't forged in molten iron or carved by human hands. These keys shimmered with an essence older than time itself, etched with the living language of eternity, pulsing with the very breath of God. There was the key of Hades, the key that governed the grim dominion of the grave that locked away countless souls under sentences of death. And Lucifer, once the bright morning star, now twisted into the prince of shadows, stood powerless to halt what unfolded. No sneer curved his lips, no arrogant retort fell from his tongue. Not a single demon, no matter how vile or ancient, dared utter a challenge. The silence was deafening thick with dread, because they all understood this was no theft. This was a rightful reclamation, by the only one who ever had authority to take them. As Jesus grasped those keys, the entire underworld seemed to sigh, as if the walls of Sheol themselves felt the shift of dominion. Then he turned eyes ablaze with a fire deeper than judgment, locking them onto Michael. And with just 3 words, he shattered the stillness of countless ages' time to rise. Can you imagine the weight of that command, spoken not as a hopeful plea, but as a kingly edict that creation itself could not resist? Most people missed this staggering truth. Resurrection didn't begin at the tomb outside Jerusalem. It wasn't sparked by rolling away a stone. No, it started right here in the bowels of death's own fortress. It started the very moment death was forced to kneel before the one it thought it had conquered. Chains that had coiled around souls for centuries burst apart like brittle reeds. Shackles fell from patriarchs and prophets who had waited in faith in dim, forgotten corners of the spiritual realm. Angels who had watched silently for generations now lit torches of holy flame, driving back shadows that had never known such brilliance. Michael, with his sword still drawn, stood guard as heaven's enforcer, ensuring that no dark power could contest this mass exodus. Uriel, radiant with mysteries finally unveiled, unleashed waves of divine light that ignited destiny's long-delayed opening eyes in ways no earthly preacher ever could. Can you grasp what this means for you? Jesus didn't slip quietly out of death's back door, hoping to escape notice. He didn't tiptoe past locked cells. He conquered death from the inside out. He dismantled its claim at its very core, leaving the enemy's throne room in ruin. And when he rose 3 days later, in the early light of dawn, he didn't emerge alone. He carried with him a parade of liberated souls, a procession of freedom that still stretches through the corridors of time, reaching even to hearts like yours. So, when you envision the resurrection, don't picture merely a stone rolling aside in a garden. Picture the gates of the underworld splitting open, the authority of death itself stripped away, and Jesus walking out triumphantly with keys in hand, declaring not just his own victory, but yours, and every life he pulled from that smothering darkness into glorious light. Isn't it possible that right now, those same words, time to rise, are echoing through the locked places of your soul, ready to fling wide the doors you thought would never open? So now, you truly see when Jesus was nailed to that rugged cross abandoned by friends, and surrounded by sneering crowds, he was anything but defeated. He was not weak, not forsaken, not overpowered by the machinery of Rome or the schemes of hell. In that harrowing silence, dripping with agony, he was commanding celestial armies. Even as blood poured from his battered body, he was issuing orders that rippled through the spirit realm, orchestrating a conquest so profound it overturned the throne of death itself. Michael stood nearby, his massive form almost quivering with pent-up power, sword unsheathed not to slice through mortal flesh and bone, but to guard the most sacred transaction in eternity. This was no skirmish over borders or empires. This was the safeguarding of a transfer that rewrote the legal standing of every soul ever born. With that sword, Michael enforced heaven's decree, ensuring that no demon could twist the covenant Jesus was ratifying with his own lifeblood. And Uriel, that living blaze of revelation, didn't simply watch. He wasn't there as a passive observer cataloging divine history. He burned with the hidden mysteries of God. Mysteries sealed up before the sun ever shone or seas ever roared. Now, at the foot of a Roman execution, he poured out light to expose what had been hidden for ages, that salvation would come not by force of angelic legions, but by a lamb slaughtered in silence. Picture it. While men wept in confusion, and Rome laughed at what they thought was the pathetic end of a misguided teacher, the demonic realm shrieked in panic. Heaven, by contrast, stood at full attention. Angels lining invisible battlements, spirits of righteous men holding their breath because they all knew this was the pivot upon which eternity would turn. So when Jesus finally gasped out, "It is finished," the entire cosmos felt the words cut through it. Like a blade of living light, Michael raised his sword high, a silent decree that sealed the victory in realms beyond mortal comprehension. Uriel, his hands still glowing with unveiled secrets, rolled up the scroll of God's mysteries with solemn reverence, for what was prophesied had now been accomplished. And in that instant, the axis of history shifted forever. Now, let this settle deep into your spirit. It means you were never designed to fight life's cruelest battles alone. Even in your lowest hour, when your body is racked by weakness, when your mind is swarmed by shadows, and your prayers seem to drift unanswered into cold silence, heaven is not indifferent. Angels are still on assignment. God's strategy is still advancing through dimensions you can't see. And there is a power in your quiet endurance that hell cannot comprehend. Because sometimes your greatest victory comes not through loud triumph or shouted declarations, but through simply holding on as Jesus did, trusting that unseen hands are shifting everything in your favor. So, pause now and let these piercing questions echo inside you. What truly unfolded on that bleak hill called Golgotha? Why did the sky cloak itself in unnatural darkness at high noon, as if creation itself could no longer bear to look? Why did the temple's colossal veil tear apart, exposing what had been hidden for centuries? And why did two of heaven's greatest angels stand in grave silence over a scene so soaked in blood and brutality? Because this was no random execution. It was divine strategy at its most incomprehensible. It was sacrifice uttering silent commandments, a king laying down his life not merely to taste death, but to reclaim every shred of inheritance we forfeited. Michael knew it. His sword testified to it. Uriel saw it. His revelations streamed with it. And now, you've glimpsed it too. Perhaps the next time your world goes dark, You'll remember some of heaven's most earth-shattering victories are born, in places where it looks like all is lost. And in that knowing, you'll find the courage to stand your ground. Because the same King who orchestrated this cosmic triumph still commands angels on your behalf. When you look back at this story, at the cross, at Michael standing guard, with sword aloft, at Uriel unveiling mysteries that lit even the dark halls of death, you see that it was never just about one moment in history. It was about every moment that would come after. It was about you, about your own valleys of shadow, your silent nights of anguish, your battles that rage deeper than anyone else can see. Because what Jesus accomplished was not only the crushing of death's claim, it was also the guarantee that you would never have to stand alone in your fiercest storms. Even now, in seasons where your strength runs out and your prayers seem to echo unanswered, there are angelic warriors enforcing the decrees spoken over your life. There is divine light illuminating hidden places in your soul, breaking chains you thought would bind you forever. To me, that's one of the most breathtaking truths of all, that the same King who descended into Sheol, who took the keys of death right from under the enemy's throne, still whispers over your life, "Time to rise." That's not just poetry. That's your spiritual reality. Heaven is always moving, even in your silence. Sometimes, your most powerful stand is simply to endure, trusting that unseen hands are shaping victories far beyond what you can yet understand. So let this story breathe hope into your heart. Let it remind you that God's plans are often accomplished in ways that defy human wisdom. That your darkest hours might actually be preparing the stage for your brightest dawn. That when all seems lost, heaven may be closest armies arrayed and strategies unfolding on your behalf. If this message stirred something deep inside you, I'd love for you to stay on this journey with us. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to know that their battles are never fought alone. And I would truly cherish it if you drop a comment below. Maybe just a simple, "Oh man," or tell us what part of this story spoke to your heart. Thank you for spending these precious moments with me, exploring mysteries that stretch from ancient scrolls to the corners of your own life. May the God who conquered death continue to walk beside you, lift you, and lead you into victories you never imagined possible. God bless you abundantly.